Hello and welcome to Seminary Reacts, where we ask professors to read Reddit questions and stories. Today I am joined by Jamie Pitts. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Amy.
What do you teach? What's your role?
I am the professor of Anabaptist Studies, and I teach a variety of courses related to history and theology.
Cool. What's your experience with Reddit before we dive in?
I access Reddit fairly frequently to get recipes or random facts that I'm looking for, but I don't use it. I don't subscribe to any subreddits.
You're not there for the drama?
I'm not there for the drama.
Okay.
No.
Okay. Well, we'll look at a little bit of drama today, but mostly we'll be looking at some of the questions and advice that people are putting on Reddit. Are you ready for the first question?
Let's go.
All right. Our first question comes from the subreddit Ask a Pastor. The question is, why do pastors' kids rebel? So the OP says, I have an honest question based on an observation I've made throughout my life. While it's not true for all, I've noticed it's fairly common that many pastors' kids end up rebelling or living differently from their parents. In some cases, they even seem to go in the complete opposite direction of what they were taught. This appears especially true with daughters of pastors who rebel significantly once they move out of the house or go to college. What are the reasons behind this?
Wow, okay. And you're asking me because why?
Well, why do you think I would be?
Because I am a pastor's kid.
I am also a pastor's kid,
Okay.
for the record. So
Okay.
It's a fair question.
Yes, it is.
I'm not just targeting you.
Yeah, well, I don't know about the daughter's part. You would have to answer that. And because I have one brother, so I don't have other siblings. But I will say that there can be an immense pressure on the family of pastors to kind of perform the perfect Christian family thing. And the kids can get the worst of that sometimes. Get it from both parents. And I do think growing up in that kind of context can make you see what goes on behind the scenes. And so you see the kind of gap between the way theological language is used, the way church ritual and gathering is used, and it can be a really powerful source of belonging, but it's very confusing when you see the same people who are leading that kind of behind closed doors acting very differently than the way they talk in front. So that would be my perspective.
Were you rebellious? Did you fit the stereotype of a rebellious pastor's kid?
I mean, I was very much, I've been a church person my whole life, so in that way, no. But certainly questioned and in various ways. I mean, I will say, because I grew up in the Episcopal Church, and I joined kind of like a charismatic Pentecostal church in college, and definitely from my parents' perspective, that was very weird and kind of a form of rebellion, even though to me it was like, I'm trying to follow Jesus. It looked very weird to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know for myself, my mom is a pastor. Well, currently she's not, but she didn't become a full-time pastor until I was in college. But before that, she worked at the church that I was attending, that I had attended since I was born. So I feel like even though she wasn't like a full pastor, I still got that experience for some of my life. But I don't think I was rebellious at all. I don't think my parents would say I was rebellious either. I was very much a goody two shoes. So, but I mean, I did see. I have seen times where pastors' kids do just feel so much pressure to live a very specific way.
Right.
And that kind of leads them to, I mean, I think it's pretty natural for teenagers to just want to do something different than their parents.
Yeah.
And I know like my mom was also a pastor's kid.
Okay.
So, but she was like lifetime a pastor's kid. And I know something that she talked about was being in the fishbowl and just the reality that like when you're in the family of the pastor, I mean, it's kind of like everything that happens, like all the attention is on your
Right.
family. And there's not like I think in a way, I think all like especially teenagers are rebellious in some way
Sure.
because there's a desire to separate from the parents. But I think because there's like the fishbowl aspect of being watched by everyone in the church, it's just like amplified.
Yeah.
So like it could be that pastors' kids aren't actually that rebellious compared to others. They're just paid
Sure.
attention to more.
And I would say it's not even like, when you talk about the fishbowl, it's not even, the feeling is not just that you're being watched on like big things. It's also like, was I late to church?
Right.
How was my
Right.
dressing? I mean, some of that, like the appearance it probably depends on the church and the family and whatever, but it can feel very, very intense, and the desire to escape that
Yeah.
can be intense.
Oh, there was definitely a time or two that I was told like oh, don't tell that story to anyone at church. Just yeah, because we did want to maintain our privacy in the church.
Sure.
But yeah, it's an interesting dynamic to be in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, ready for the next question?
Okay.
Okay, the next question comes from the subreddit Christianity. The question is, why does "What would Jesus do?" so the acronym WWJD, so often fail as a strategy for living? On the face of it, asking ourselves, what would Jesus do whenever we have a decision to make would seem to be an excellent way to imitate and obey him. However, experience demonstrates that those who profess to be guided in their life decisions by this method seldom get admired as being like Jesus. Why is this? Of course, a certain number of people make this profession hypocritically. That is, they say they're guided this way, but don't really live it out. I'm not talking about those people. I'm asking why people who sincerely act on this principle seldom seem to actually become like Jesus. So, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the phrase.
Oh, of course, yeah. I mean, when I was in, I don't know, junior high or high school, it became very popular for people to wear like these bracelets.
Yeah,
It said WWJD.
yeah.
And I think supposedly it goes back to this novel called In His Steps by Charles Sheldon. I don't know, from like the early 20th century or something. But obviously there's a much older tradition that includes like a book called The Imitation of Christ from the late Middle Ages in the Netherlands. And, you know, the Gospels, which are written to invite us into a life of following Jesus. So I would hope that in some general way, like this idea about what would Jesus do would be valuable and valid for us. But, okay, I mean, here's two issues with it. One, in the context where I was hearing that language used, the understanding and engagement of Jesus' teachings was so superficial that the answer to that, what would you do question, was similarly like paper thin. You know, it wasn't like a serious wrestling with Jesus' teachings and how they might change and challenge our lives. It was more in church context where sin was understood very narrowly, and mostly about not doing certain bad things. And so what would Jesus do? Well, Jesus wouldn't do those bad things. But many of those bad things, Jesus didn't really have a lot to talk about. And the stuff that Jesus did talk about, like economics and enemy love and so forth, are very, very challenging. So that's part of it. The other part of it, I would say, is it's this question of what would Jesus do? Okay, that gets us so far because we're called to be, yes, imitators of Christ in the footsteps of Christ, but we also live in different contexts. And so there's a creativity about our life as disciples. It's not simply what would Jesus do. We have to do serious analysis of where we live, our context, what it means to be Christ followers here and now. Jesus says at the end of the story of the Good Samaritan, go and do likewise. Likewise. That introduces the possibility of careful and creative thinking about, okay, what is likewise? Not the exact same thing, but something in that pattern that adjusts to the present. So I think part of the problem here is a kind of limited imagination for what it means to follow Jesus that doesn't, neither wrestles seriously with what Jesus actually taught, nor does it wrestle seriously with the world we live in and the imagination that we need to follow Jesus here and now.
I really like that language of imagination. I think that's something that I've heard come up here before, and I think I've seen a lot of hesitancy from people to have imagination when it comes to faith, because it feels like sometimes there's not room to be creative. Like, people believe a lot of the time that the Bible has an answer for everything, and so it kind of limits that opportunity to be creative. But I think if we look at Jesus' life, there's so many times when he was, kind of taking creative liberty a little bit. Sure. Even by talking about the story of the Good Samaritan and doing something that was so out of the box for a lot of people, that story was pretty radical.
Yeah.
And really challenged, there was an expert of the law that was asking him questions, and I think that's creative in itself.
Yeah, it's interesting. What would Jesus do? Be creative.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we don't tend to think about imitating Jesus's creativity, his social creativity, his theological creativity. Like you said, we see these as kind of pre-given answers that we just fit into these boxes in our lives. But what if the invitation is to go and do likewise in the pattern of a creative response to the context?
So go and do likewise. That can be a new acronym. Yeah.
There you go.
Replace WWJD
Yes.
with go and do likewise.
I love that.
Yeah.
I'm waiting for the bracelet, Amy.
All right. That'll be our merch for the podcast, is go and do likewise.
You're going to make so much money.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Our next question is coming from the subreddit Ask a Christian.
Okay.
And the question is, how exactly does holy water work? And there's a lot that this OP has to say about it. So the OP says, back in the early 80s, my mother met the Pope, and he blessed this little antique bottle of water she had brought with her. This was her holy water. As a Catholic, she used it in much the same way Catholics use it, entering and exiting church by dabbing their fingers in it and making the sign of the cross. Only my mother used the little bottle blessed by the Pope when she prayed at home. Over the years, the Pope's holy water began to dwindle, so my mother would use the water out of the faucets next to the door at the church to top it off. So what is up with holy water anyway? Is water blessed by the Pope extraordinarily deadly to vampires, above and beyond your typical garden variety church holy water? Did her addition of general purpose bulk holy water diffuse the effectiveness of the Pope's super holy water? The holy water level in the bottle is extremely low now. There's only a few milliliters left. If I top it off with regular tap water, does this nullify the holiness? This bottle and the water within is so old that there is debris and particles floating around in it. I'm sure it's mineralization or possibly calcification. Is this holy solute, or is it just the liquid portion or the solvent that is holy? How does holiness of holy water work, and how does its addition enhance or alter things? What's the deal?
Okay. A Mennonite is probably not the best person to ask this question to.
Well,
but
baptism happens in the Mennonite church too.
That's true. I also grew up Episcopalian, as I mentioned, and some Episcopal churches would have like the basin of water that, and sometimes it's like the baptismal font at the front of the church, so that when you walk in, you can dip your hands in and make the sign of the cross or whatever when you're entering. And my grandmother grew up Catholic, and I've been to my fair share of Catholic churches, and there's often something like that in the front of the church. So I do have some experience with that, even though I'm Mennonite. Yeah, so what is up with that? I mean, I think, first of all, this person clearly has no experience fighting vampires, because they would know.
I mean,
it's very powerful stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, you do have stories going back to the early church about priests or bishops blessing water, and that water, usually baptismal water, but then people sometimes gathering the water after the baptism and taking it home. Or priests or bishops or whatever, like blessing other kinds of water, like the Pope in this story, that is used for at home. As far as I know, that's not a big part of Protestant traditions or the Anabaptist Mennonite tradition. Although, my parents, when they visited Israel in the 1980s, I think, or early 90s, brought home like water from the Holy Land. And
Yeah,
this was like,
I know a pastor did that too.
Yeah. I don't know what they did with this. Maybe it's in one of their closets still, like filled with this.
They don't use it?
I've never seen them use it. Yeah,
Okay.
I don't, maybe they like took a bath with it one day and
Yeah, I know a pastor who he actually uses it for baptism of the church. Like he'll just add a little bit of it
okay.
to the baptismal water.
Oh, maybe my dad has done that some. I have no idea. I never asked what happened to that water. That's a good question. I think theologically the idea is that the material world is part of a larger spiritual world. And so there are spiritual forces at play. I know the early Christian theologian Tertullian wrote about like stagnant waters. If there's stagnant water, that means there's some kind of evil spirits like involved with that water. And so baptism is supposed to be with living water, not just because of, Jesus' sayings from the Gospel of John, but also because living water is associated with good spirits from God. So there's this ancient Christian perspective that sees the material world as deeply caught up in spiritual forces. And so if we're going to make use of the material world in an important church ritual like baptism, we should, pray over it. And so that water would be holy versus unholy and potentially damaging to you. That's not so much the worldview that many of us today, at least in the United States, hold. But there's something to this, we could call it like a sacramental view, a view that the material world God uses the material world to do things in and for and with us. And perhaps the holy water, if water is part of that, like you said, in baptism, then we can affirm that God does something with the water. But from a Anabaptist or Mennonite perspective, the tendency has been to focus more on what God is doing to form God's people in all of our messy materiality, and not to say that like these particular elements like water or with the Lord's Supper, the bread or the wine, somehow shift in their like being. It's rather that God uses these ordinary materials to do things in and with and for us. So I don't know if that's quite getting at this question, but...
So do Mennonites, what are Mennonites' thoughts? do they use holy water? Like, is baptismal water for Mennonites considered holy water?
You know, it's interesting. We have sometimes at the seminary in our chapel services, we've used water in different rituals, like to make the sign of the cross on your forehead or your hand. Sometimes that's talked about as a kind of ritual way of remembering your baptism, but there's never anything said about the status of the water. Its ordinariness of water is assumed. And I think, I would say theologically, there's a commitment to seeing the material, like the ordinariness of the materials, and I say materials, I mean like water or bread, as theologically important. It's actually important that we use these and that God uses these ordinary materials, because we are quite ordinary material, and God uses us and does things with us. We can be caught up in joining God's holiness, but that, you know, we tend not to focus on, again, like the status of the materials as holy or unholy or something like that, but rather focus on what God is doing with us with these ordinary materials.
And I'm glad you brought up like looking at like the Lord's Supper with the bread and wine, because that's something that, like, listening to this kind of reminded me of, because I think looking at bread and grape juice as a part of communion, it's kind of treated, I've seen it treated in the same way. Like hearing about churches who, like, after the bread and wine or juice or whatever is blessed, like, it has to be finished. It can't just be like thrown away. But I mean, it is an interesting idea that these other churches have, that that this thing is now sacred and can't be wasted. And I don't know, but it is very different than the way that Mennonites tend to treat it.
Yeah, there's something I appreciate about it, and here's something you may not know, maybe you do, but so like I said, my dad is an Episcopal priest, so I often saw him and some of the other priests like draining these huge cups of wine. I'm like, dang. But sometimes if they didn't finish it, they had a special sink.
Yeah,
they went straight to, you've heard of this? Okay, it went straight to the ground. It didn't go into the plumbing system, because that is okay for these holy materials to like return to the earth somehow. That's fascinating to me. I think there is some kind of reverence and respect for these, well, I'm calling them materials, we could say objects or fluids and whatever. That I get that, I see that, I can honor that. I would certainly not mock. You know, there's a whole long history of Protestants mocking this kind of like sacramentality.
Right, I've seen that.
And I don't think that's very helpful, at least at this stage in history. It's probably more appropriate to recognize like the intended reverence for God and these things that God is using. But again, I kind of err on the side of what I see as the strength of the Mennonite perspective, which would say God shows up in the ordinary. God uses these ordinary things. Water that we're going to throw away, you know, the remains of into the system. God is forming us, calling us to follow Jesus in the ordinary. And, you know, with the Lord's Supper, it's in some ways even more, like the symbolism is more obvious. We're not just taking a ritual bite of bread or sip of wine. We are feeding. And Anabaptists throughout history have often thought about this not just as a little ritual nibble, but as a full meal that has economic impact within the community. It's a meal we share that includes people who may not have many resources. And so it's the ordinariness of actually being able to eat a meal that is not just symbolized, but actually enacted.
Right. I mean, it's called the Last Supper.
Exactly. So, or the Lord's Supper and in this tradition. So,
right.
That's something where I think emphasizing the ordinariness of the elements or materials or whatever can take us somewhere theological that's, I think, pretty helpful.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think like being in Mennonite spaces, I didn't really like, I mean, I know that there's a lot of conversation about the ordinary, but I'd never heard it in the context that much about like baptismal water and the elements. So that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's important. And I mean, I think it also goes along with some of the hierarchical structures in some other traditions that are called upon to make these ordinary materials holy. Like you need a priest who has been ordained by a bishop who, has some kind of special status to be able to say a prayer that makes the materials holy. And so you kind of, the whole concept of holy water in some ways rests on this whole like institutional structure that Anabaptist Mennonites have been very suspicious of. And that's not to say that this is a simple conversation. Questions of leadership, institutional structure are complicated. But again, I would err on the Anabaptist side of saying there's something really important about starting with us as mutual members of the same community. And so there's nobody here that can just, say a prayer to make that water holy. If one person can, all of us can.
Right.
Because again, it's in the ordinariness of our shared life together that we are following Jesus, inviting people to be baptized, to share in the Lord's Supper and all those kinds of things.
Which is, that's so different. Like, I mean, even for me coming from the United Methodist Church and the way that the elements have to be prayed over before and like very, very important. So even though like, I mean, when I grew up, we would have some fun ways of participating in communion with elements that are a little non-traditional. There was a youth pastor that had us do communion with Doritos and Mountain Dew. But they still had to be prayed over by a person who was like ordained to pray over them.
Wow,
I didn't witness that happening. I witnessed other blessings of the elements, but I did not witness the Doritos and Mountain Dew getting blessed. But that was still something that was very important. And
was there any controversy around that?
See, we did it while we were at camp, and so I don't know how many people in the church found out about it. But I mean, nobody questioned it in the moment. I mean, for me now, it's just a funny story to tell people, oh yeah, I've taken communion with Doritos and Mountain Dew.
See, there was a youth pastor at my church who did something like that and got in significant trouble, serious trouble.
Oh, wow.
Not from my dad, who was the pastor. My dad kind of tried to defend and protect him to some level, but yeah, it was a problem. It was a big problem. And again, it's like, because you have these set elements that have this particular status within this tradition, and there's a whole ritual and organizational structure around like ensuring that these are this is what is used. These are the prayers that can do this. These are the people who can actually. I think in this case, it was even, the youth pastor wasn't ordained.
Okay.
And so he did it, and that was like this violation of the order. Whereas, and again, there's strengths and weaknesses of these different models, but in the Anabaptist tradition, like, we could go ahead and have communion right now, even if neither of us are ordained.
Right. Yeah, well, I know the youth pastor is no longer, or none of the youth pastors that were associated with this are at that church anymore, so they're not going to get in trouble.
Should we, like, bless the water and have people at home listening, hold up their elements and we can bless them?
If you're ordained to. I know I'm not.
Too bad.
Yeah. I mean, we've done that over, I mean, I see that happening with people, like, over Zoom and, like, during the pandemic and everything, having their communion elements blessed from afar. Yeah,
I participated in a service where we did that, and I think I just didn't participate in that part. I felt so weird about that. I don't have, like, super strong theological feelings about it, but it felt, like, wrong in some way to be sitting alone. Yeah, it's like the communion part in some way, the communing.
Yeah, having it be a communal experience. Right. Yeah.
That we're actually eating the same bread and actually drinking from the same cup. Like, to me, that seems pretty important, but I could see the other side of it as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it was helpful for people
Yeah,
at that
I know
time.
it was.
So.
I didn't complain, just for the record.
No, of course
silently protested in my room.
Okay. Okay. Was it a Mennonite church that was doing that, or a different church?
Yeah, it was maybe even a conference, like a regional
Okay.
conference or something. I don't remember, but
Yeah. We could keep talking about communion for a long time, but let's move on to our next question here. This one's actually more of a story. And this person is writing on the subreddit Christianity. And the title is a question, which is, was what I said not right in this situation? And here's the story. I am a very empathetic person. I do not want anyone to feel bad. I know that is not possible because of our fallen and corrupt world. The other day, a lady came into a Christian Facebook group and says that she has an aggressive kind of cancer that has a 1% survival rate. Right away, people are telling her what herbs to take, what other options she has, making conspiracy theories, and offering prayers. Look, I get it, especially prayer. I know God could touch her or say the words and she would be immediately healed. I know we pray and have faith that God can do it, not that he will do it just because we think we know what is needed. We don't know why God does what he does. Whenever I pray, I ask for healing for those people, but also add, your will be done, meaning I accept whatever his will is, either healing here or in heaven. I responded with saying something about her going to heaven and being with the Lord. I said, this life is temporary. This life is our journey to get to our forever home, and she gets to go there just on a quicker journey. This is great comfort to me, especially since my life has been hard and a struggle from birth. I do not fear death, and I don't understand why some believers want to. To die is to gain, right? I got a few comments, not from the person with cancer, that I was not being helpful. I don't want her to die scared and questioning God if it is his will for her to be healed here on earth. God will answer the prayer of healing in heaven if not here. Was I wrong to respond that way?
I don't know if the person was wrong. I think their response in many ways is better than the people like offering herbs and whatever, but
And conspiracy theories.
And conspiracy theories especially. You know, I think pastoral care over the internet with strangers is probably extremely difficult because you really need to know, you kind of need to feel like the emotional, you need to have an emotional connection to be able to feel like what would actually be helpful here. Is this person looking for solutions? Like, I've got this 1% chance, what else you got? Is that what's being asked here? Are they really just asking for prayer, empathy? The saying, you know, you're going to heaven and quicker, like, I get the impulse there, but the OP could have been, you know, quite terrified of death and for any sort of reason. And so just kind of applying this theory, well, we're Christians, so we're going to go to heaven, like, that doesn't necessarily, even though we might think it should, it doesn't necessarily help someone who is feeling very scared and desperate. And so, you know, again, I get and appreciate the impulse behind that person, but I would say unless you really know the person and can engage them in some kind of conversation, sticking with words of empathy and sort of solidarity in the sense of, like in this case, on the internet, probably just offering prayers. But yeah, I mean, because often what is the most helpful there is just that kind of being with. And it may not even be verbal. You know, if you're with somebody, it may not be verbal. It may just be sitting with them. In this kind of setting, again, it may just be like offering words of comfort and hope. Not necessarily hope of like, this is going to happen to you, so you're fine.
Right.
Because, you know, the idea that we would be somehow kind of managing their pain and their fear so that they wouldn't have it anymore, like, that's not helpful in any way. Just being with the person and trying to, if it's appropriate, if the person wants to engage more to see what they really need. But I'd be hesitant to try to offer much more.
Yeah. And I think, like, the dynamic of trying to do this over Facebook, I mean, the OP did not say, like, what exactly the person had said who posted about the cancer, just that it was a 1% survival rate. So we don't really know if there was any, like, if it was just, like, it was in a Christian Facebook group, which I know in those kind of groups, there's typically, like, a just posting and saying, hey, this is what's happening to me, please pray.
Right.
I think typically those kind of posts are not asking for people to give recommendations for, like, what to do in response to it.
Yeah.
But I think, like, and again, like, it would depend on what this person said. I think this idea that this OP has accepted, like, when they pray, they're going to end with a "Your will be done." I think that
Right.
is a powerful thing.
Yeah.
I think it's definitely like, and it's a process that people have to get to. I mean, I've heard plenty of sermons about this, just like how difficult it is to truly get to a point where you can say whatever God's will is
Right.
can be done. And I think I say that just to, like, validate the OP's ideas and saying, like, yes, that's a powerful thing to get to a point that you can say your will be done. But the thing is, it has to be a process, a personal
Right.
process. And in this situation, especially with such a tragic situation, just jumping to, okay, let's get to the your will be done part now. Like, we don't know where this lady who posted on Facebook is with that. That has to be a process that she comes to. And if her post is saying that she has an aggressive form of cancer and she's expecting that she's going to pass away and she's accepted that that might be the outcome for her life, then I think the OP saying something about her, like the OP says, I responded with saying something about her going to heaven and being with the Lord. At that point, I think that would be okay to make that kind of comment because the person has already gotten there. But rushing people into the "your will be done" is not exactly appropriate.
No, when the person who asked this question was saying that they pray that, I was, okay, we're off to a good start, because I do think a sort of pastoral prayer that was open-ended, that was offering comfort and assurance of God's faithfulness and comfort and all these things, could include that kind of language of "your will be done," without it being sort of this lesson, and that's where the person sort of spun off into, in this lesson of, because God's will be done, maybe you'll be dead soon, and you should be fine with that. Like, that doesn't really get us very far. And the other thing is, I think kind of a pastoral presence needs to be able to, like you said, honor the process and not sort of project. So much of the time we want to offer advice when somebody comes to us with a problem, and part of that is probably out of our own discomfort.
Right.
Like, we want to, again, to use that language, like, manage it, and so it can go away. Either by this person saying, "Thank you, I took those herbs and now I'm healed," or "Thanks, now I've just accepted that I'm going to die and I'll be fine with God." I do think there's ways that we can, whether through prayer or through the kind of language we use in response to someone who shared this kind of experience, talk about our hope as Christians, God's presence, in ways that are open-ended, that don't, like, rest on either, like, the promise that God will heal you, or, nope, you're dying. Like, we can talk about our hope, God's faithfulness, God's presence, without saying any of that other stuff. And so I guess that's where I would hope this person could develop their pastoral presence on the internet or wherever, to be able to offer appropriate words of assurance, rather than trying to give some outcome and make advice based off of their hope that, this person who is suffering will, be fixed in some way.
Yeah. Our next question is coming from the subreddit Ask a Christian. The question is, what's the Christian solution to the trolley problem? So OP actually gives a description of the trolley problem that I'm very impressed with, because every time I explain it, I have to have a diagram. So for those unfamiliar with the problem, there is a runaway trolley barreling down the railway tracks. Ahead on the tracks, there are 5 people tied up and unable to move. The trolley is headed straight for them. You are standing some distance off in the train yard next to a lever. If you pull this lever, the trolley will switch to a different set of tracks. However, you notice that there is one person on the side track. You have 2 options: do nothing and allow the trolley to kill the 5 people on the main track, or pull the lever, diverting the trolley onto the side track where it will kill 1 person. Which is the more ethical option, or more simply, what is the right thing to do? The philosophers have been coming up with various solutions depending on their worldview over the years, but if the morality comes from the nature of God, it means this problem should have one solution, something that God himself would do if he was a human in this situation. So the question is, what decision would God like you to make when faced with this type of problem?
Okay, well, let's start off with saying that I completely disagree with this idea that there must be one solution, because if God were here, God would only do one thing. This comes back to some of what we were talking about earlier in terms of the creativity that Jesus invites us into. But it suggests that essentially the picture or the image, the imagination behind that language that you just read is that human life basically consists of these like invariant moral problems, and there's one solution to each of them. And God, if God were here, God would give the right decision, and our goal is just to figure out what that decision would be, and then do that thing in that context. It reduces human life to like a machine, and human knowledge to kind of a machine, like figuring out what is it that God would do, and then regulating our lives to make sure that we just do that one thing. And I think that's totally misleading and unhelpful. So what is a Christian response to the trolley problem? There is a strand of ethics called the ethics of care that arose in the 1970s and 80s, that in part took on philosophy that assumed that these kinds of problems were meaningful for the moral reflection. And one of the things that ethicists have argued is that those kind of problems only become meaningful if you abstract from actual human life with all its complexities and all the kind of relationships that actually make us who we are. And it's actually by putting ourselves in the middle of those relationships rather than jumping out of them into a kind of an abstract problem like the trolley problem, where it's by putting ourselves in the midst of those relationships where we actually can find the moral guidance that we need. And it's reflecting on the complexity of our situations, and obviously this problem is supposed to confront us with the complexity. But we see that often there is a moral kind of outcome that isn't an either or, like this assumes, if we actually pay attention to the reality, the relational kinds of bonds that we have. Does the person, does the one person on the track, as opposed to the 5, say, is that a close friend of mine whom I trust and know to be a giving person who begs me to actually sacrifice them for the sake of the 5? That makes a huge difference. And any kind of answer to this problem can't be just abstracted from those kinds of relationships. So, I would take an ethics of care kind of approach to the trolley problem that says it's kind of a pseudo problem in some ways, and we need to offer, we need to think much more carefully about actual moral issues and moral situations, and not just focus our ethical reasoning on these kind of problem cases, but actually focus on what does abundance look like, what does flourishing look like, what does nonviolence look like in this case. And again, think creatively, imaginatively about possibilities for moral flourishing and friendship that go beyond just, well, I got to kill these people to save this person, or we're all doomed, or something like that. So I think a kind of thicker, more particular understanding of morality, to me, is consistent with a number of different Christian commitments, including the incarnation. God doesn't just become all creatures at the same time in every single place to make the right decision. God becomes one limited human being and navigates the particularity of that context. And then, as we've been talking about, invites us to be creatively engaging in the same spirit, our own context, rather than, thinking in this very abstract way.
That's an incredibly nuanced way of talking about this
Sorry.
for the internet. Which actually, I mean, well, I guess the subreddit Ask a Christian does not have verdicts on their posts, but the verdict, basically, of this from the people in the comments was that there is not a Christian solution to the trolley problem.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, not with all the ethics of care stuff, but yeah. So you don't but taking away the nuance of it.
Taking away the nuance. Yeah.
Is there a scenario that you would imagine? Any scenario? I know I have one.
Okay, what's yours?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about Christianity, Jesus would stop the trolley himself. He would just jump in front of the trolley.
Okay.
Right? That seems like it'd be the right answer.
I see. Self-sacrifice, certainly. Yeah. That is a central, no greater love than one who gives up their life for their friends. I can see that.
I do think in reality there's a lot of nuance to this, and I think you're right in your answer, but I mean, having an answer is also fun.
Sure. Okay. But I think the easy counter then is, well, what if it's totally ineffective? What if, one person jumping in front of a train doesn't necessarily stop the train from keeping going?
That's fair.
So this is partially why these kind of moral problems, they can just lead to interminable debate that doesn't get us very far, in my opinion.
I think it's interesting, though. You mentioned earlier, what if one of the people, the one person on the tracks, is a person who wants to sacrifice themselves for the other 5 people. And I think it's interesting to think of ourselves as the people on the tracks. I know, I had a conversation with my family one time. We were watching something and it brought up the trolley problem or just some other ethical dilemma. And it was this conversation about if it was one of us on the tracks as the one person and then the other 5 people are complete strangers, I know that my family was really split with it. Some of my family said, no, I would not want you to sacrifice me for the other people. And I think it might have been my dad who said, no, if this scenario were ever to happen, if you didn't sacrifice me for the other people, I would be really angry with you. So, I mean, but it's interesting to think about ourselves on the tracks.
Yeah, well, this is part of the thing. I mean, these sort of thought experiments typically assume we are the moral decider with power to accomplish whatever we set out to do. And there can be a clarifying, helpful aspect of that. But in many cases, we're not the powerful person.
Right.
We're not the person who can just make things happen. What does it mean to think about kind of ethics, morality from the underside, from the place of powerlessness? The ethics, one of the classic kind of thought experiments, and from a classic thought experiment from the ethics of care, which Carol Gilligan, a psychologist who contributed to this way of thinking about ethics, actually kind of talked to a lot of people about and heard their responses. And so her reflection is not simply logical analysis, but it's hearing people reflect on it. And one of the things she heard is, well, the thought experiment has to do with like someone who's dying of a disease that's treatable and there's medicine available widely, but they don't have the money or the insurance to get that medicine. So steal or not steal. And the people that Gilligan interviewed were saying, well, what if I know the pharmacist, or what if I could like have a conversation? So it was again a relational approach that completely changed the logic of I'm an individual and I have to use my power to make this happen, even if there's bad consequences. A kind of more relational perspective might help us be more creative.
Yeah. It's interesting to think, like the moral dilemmas are always really interesting, but it is sometimes hard to, I think, apply the Christian lens to it.
Well,
unfortunately,
until God comes and answers the question for us, I guess.
That can be, that can be the first question when Jesus comes back. Is
how would you? What were you gonna do in the trolley problem? We wouldn't have any trolley problems, of course, if Jesus comes back.
That's true.
All the trains stop. All the people live.
All the people live. That would be Jesus' answer.
There you
all
go.
The people live. Yeah. All right, we have one last story.
Okay.
This is kind of a feel-good story. So this story is coming from the subreddit Confession, where people make confessions. And the story title is, "Everyone thinks I caught our office lunch thief. I didn't. I started packing them a meal on purpose." So this story goes, we've had a lunch thief at work for months. Stuff disappears from the break room fridge between 12:15 and 12:30 like clockwork. At first I was curious. My glass container kept coming back greasy or not at all. One day I got in early and saw someone I don't know well, probably a new temp, standing with the fridge open, just staring. He closed it and walked out with nothing. He looked wrecked, like he'd been crying in his car. That image would not leave my head. The next week I started bringing 2 lunches, one in my usual container and a second in a cheap grocery store plastic box with a sticky note that just says, "For whoever forgot." I put it in the back left corner where the thief always strikes. The theft stopped being random and started becoming predictable. The container is always returned rinsed. Sometimes there's a folded paper towel under the box like he's trying to be neat. Last Friday, there was a single peppermint left on top. Dumb little detail, but it got me. Coworkers think I set up cameras or confronted someone because my real lunch stopped going missing. I didn't. I just redirected the problem. It's not heroic, it's probably enabling, but I can afford rice and chicken more than someone can afford being hungry at work. I'm not asking for a medal. I'm confessing that I was angrier than I want to admit, and now I'm weirdly protective of a stranger who eats at 12:20. If management installs cameras, I won't stop them. Until then, I'll keep packing too.
Wow.
Yeah. That's kind of a nice, I thought this was a nice story.
It's a very nice story, and actually it's very appropriate to follow the trolley problem question.
I think so too. That was not intentional, but I think that's
well, and I was thinking about some other things I wanted to say about the trolley problem that this helps us think about very clearly. From the relational perspective of care ethics, you can think about, again, who am I in this? What are the relations with the conductor, the people on the tracks, or if I'm a person on the track, and so forth. From a kind of more structural perspective, you could think about what is it that's leading people to tie up other people and put them on train tracks, and how can we address those issues? Mm-hmm. Similarly here, and this is a real theological problem, because this issue could be addressed from a certain understanding of the judgment of God, the law of God, or so forth. Yeah. Stealing is wrong. It is bad. It must be punished.
Right.
But this person has been given a window into the humanity of the perpetrator, and they've responded in kind.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't responded in this abstract, impartial way that just says the law must be applied, and therefore this person must be caught and punished. Rather, they responded seeing the actual human issue and met that need. And it's not to say that there couldn't be, advocacy, solidarity to address the deeper issues causing this person to be hungry or something like that. There could be more, but just in this little way, justice is being done through actually feeding a coworker,
Right.
which seems quite a significant and creative response.
Mm-hmm. You could say that this person listened to Jesus' command to go and do likewise.
Wow, you just brought it
Pulled it all together.
full circle.
Yeah. But I think it's actually sometimes pretty tricky to find these kind of stories on Reddit. Just because when people are posting, a lot of the time it's heartbreaks, it's drama,
Right.
it's a lot of depressing and sometimes enraging stuff. So finding this story was it's quite a gem. It's nice to see some humanity.
Way to go, OP.
Yes. And I think for anybody listening, if you have stories that are like this, please tell them, because I think more people need to be posting positive stories like this.
Yeah, and both to get us out of the fantasy that thinking about the trolley problem one more time will actually make much of a difference.
Yeah.
This gives us a story to live by, a story that helps spark our imaginations, that could be contagious in helping us address some of the real problems around us in creative ways that actually meet needs, both the needs of the people whose lunch was getting stolen and the person who's hungry.
Right. So yeah, this story was more effective in telling us how we should be living than asking the question of what's the Christian solution to the trolley problem,
Right.
even though it's fun to think about. But this one gave us more of an example of this is what we should be doing.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah. Well, what are your impressions of Reddit now that you've heard some stories and questions here?
I mean, it's pretty amazing. I've never looked at any of these subreddits, so to get a window into the kind of pastoral questions, the theological questions, the moral questions that are being asked and hopefully seriously responded to, I think it's pretty special. I'm glad that there are places that people are having these kind of conversations, because in the social media that I've used, not Reddit, the sort of conversations that people have are not nearly this vulnerable or constructive.
Oh yeah.
And vulnerability is just hammered over and over again. So I gotta say, Reddit, I'm intrigued.
You're impressed. Yeah. Well, thank you for joining me here and listening to some stories and questions.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for listening to Seminary Reacts. Please leave us a like, a positive review, and comment any questions or stories for us to react to. You can find Seminary Reacts on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. See you next time. Bye.